The colony of Vesta 7 was humanity's hope for a new world. A self-sustaining colony, rich with resources, complete with a thriving agriculture sector, mining operations, and research labs. The sky was a deep, eternal blue. The air was thin, but breathable. It was a perfect home, until the sinkholes appeared. At first, they were minor, small collapses in the north farming quadrant, occasional structural instability in the mines. The colony's governor, Elias Vance, assured everyone it was normal. Just settling ground, nothing more. Then, the disappearances started. A miner named Hector Lee was the first. He'd gone below on routine maintenance, his comms cut out mid-sentence. His tracker blinked offline. No sign of a cave-in, no distress call, nothing. He was just gone. They sent a drone. It went dark 2 minutes later. Vance told the colony to move on. Hector was just unlucky. But at night, when the winds howled through the settlement, some workers claimed they could hear his voice beneath the ground. The noise was unsettling, an eerie hum that seemed to rise and fall like breathing. A few engineers theorized seismic activity, but Fisk, the colony's lead scientist, was unconvinced. There had been no tremors, no shifting tectonic plates. The planet, at least in geological terms, was stable. So why did the sounds seem to grow louder every night? The colony's livestock also began to behave strangely. The imported birds, meant to help regulate insect populations, stopped chirping. They refused to go near the sinkholes, circling the colony like they were waiting for something. The farm cattle, usually docile, began thrashing in their pens, their bodies shivering as if reacting to a frequency no one else could hear. The colony's automated weather sensors began failing, but only at night. The reports would show temperature spikes, sharp increases in atmospheric pressure, even oxygen depletion near the dig sites. But when examined, there was no physical change. By the time Fisk conducted manual readings, the equipment no longer worked at all. Each instrument flickered erratically, producing numbers that contradicted each other. One reading showed the soil as dry, dead rock, while another reported moisture levels consistent with a thriving ecosystem. Something was wrong. They just didn't know what yet. 2 nights after Hector disappeared, he came back. It was security that saw him first. A lone figure crawling out of the soil near the dig site. His limbs twisted at unnatural angles, his skin ashen and stretched too tight. His eyes were glazed over, his mouth slightly open, but he was not breathing. Dr. Eleanor Fisk, the colony's lead scientist, was called to assess him. What she found defied all logic. Hector's body temperature was cold, but his heart was still beating, slow and irregular. His veins were thickened, his blood moving sluggishly, black in color. Then he spoke. His voice was not his own. It came layered, distorted, in whispers that echoed upon themselves. Go deeper. And then he lunged. Security opened fire. 6 rounds, center mass. Hector collapsed, but his mouth kept moving, as though still whispering in silence. That night, the winds howled louder. By morning, 4 more colonists had vanished. No trace, no signs of struggle. The security footage glitched out at the moment of their disappearance. And then, they returned. They stood at the edge of the colony motionless, their heads tilted as if listening. Their bodies looked normal at first glance, but their movements were wrong, deliberate, measured, like they were adjusting to something. One of them, Marcus Lang, smiled too wide and whispered,
"You were never meant to leave."
And then, all the lights in the colony flickered at once. Vance ordered a full lockdown. The returned colonists were quarantined, their vitals monitored, but their brain scans showed something unexplainable. Waves that didn't match human brain activity, but something else, a frequency pulsing in time with the underground tremors. The rest of the colony grew uneasy. People began whispering about Hector's return, about the voices in the wind. Then Caleb Rigg, a mining engineer, shot himself in his quarters. Before pulling the trigger, he wrote in shaky letters, "I can hear it. It knows me now." The next night, the ground shook violently, not an earthquake, but something rhythmic, controlled. Then the soil began to move on its own, rippling in waves like something beneath was breathing. The quarantined colonists stopped responding. They sat motionless, staring forward. When security tried to restrain one of them, his body collapsed inwards, folding like paper, before dissolving into black sludge that seeped into the floor, disappearing as though the colony itself absorbed him. Power failed across the settlement. Emergency lights flickered, casting long shadows through the empty streets. Then the whispering began. Not just from the quarantined, everywhere. The comms, the vents, the wind outside. It all whispered their names. Vance and Fisk gathered what remained of security. They had one choice: stay in the colony or go below and find the source of this horror. They chose to go deeper. The tunnels were not the same as before. Walls that were once carved rock had shifted, now smooth and pulsing, as if alive. One of the security officers, Daniels, turned to Fisk, his voice shaking. "These walls, they're moving." The deeper they went, the more the air grew thick, filled with the scent of something decaying, something sweet. Then they saw it. The remains of the previous missing colonists, suspended within the walls, half absorbed, their mouths frozen in silent screams. Their eyes followed them as they passed. They reached the chamber at the heart of the tunnels, a vast, cathedral-like expanse. At the center, something pulsed, a mass of tangled bodies, shifting, twisting, forming new shapes, new mouths, new eyes. It wasn't a planet. It was something old, something buried here long before humanity arrived. Vesta 7 was never meant to be inhabited. It was a prison. And now, they had broken the seal. Fisk turned to Vance, horror dawning in her eyes. "We have to leave. We have to—" It was too late. The walls began shifting, the mass expanding, the bodies within it turning toward them in unison.
Join us.
The security team opened fire, but the bullets did nothing. The walls swallowed the sound, absorbing the rounds like they had never existed. Then, the first of them was taken. Daniels, pulled screaming into the blackened mass, his body disappearing within the folds of the living wall. Vance grabbed Fisk's arm, dragging her back toward the exit. But the tunnels had changed. The way they came was gone, replaced with only one path forward. Down. The tunnels no longer resembled the mining shafts they had once been. The further the group moved downward, the more the walls became slick, pulsing, like living tissue stretched into corridors. The air grew thick, humid, filled with the sickly scent of rotting fruit and decay. Their boots squelched against the ground, and soon they realized why. The floor was no longer rock, it was flesh. Daniels muttered a curse under his breath. The sound echoed, not in the way a normal tunnel would, but as though something had heard him and repeated it back, slightly distorted. "Fisk!" Vance's voice was tense. He held his rifle close. "This place, it's changing around us." Fisk turned, her pulse hammering in her skull. She could feel it now, the undeniable truth clawing at the edges of her mind. They were inside something, not just the planet. It had been shifting, reshaping itself, as if they had been swallowed whole and were moving deeper into its digestive system. Then, the walls shuddered, the air grew colder, and just ahead, a sound that froze them all in place, breathing, slow, deep, ancient. Something was awake. The whispering returned, no longer distant, no longer faint. Now it was inside their skulls, layered voices overlapping, speaking in tongues that made no sense and yet carried meaning. "You are home!" Daniel screamed, clutching his ears. Blood ran from his nose. His skin rippled, as though something beneath it was trying to push its way out. "Help me!" His words choked off as his body snapped backward, his spine bending the wrong way. He was lifted off the ground, his arms stretching too far, his mouth opening in a soundless scream as he dissolved into the tunnel walls. His face remained, embedded within the pulsing flesh, his eyes still moving, still aware. Fisk staggered back, bile rising in her throat. We can't be here." Vance grabbed her, shaking her hard. "Fisk, we have to move. Now." They ran, but the tunnels did not allow escape. The walls shifted, leading them in circles, herding them deeper, always deeper.
Come. Below.
The chamber they stumbled into was vast, larger than anything human hands could have built. The walls breathed, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the beating in their chests. The ceiling stretched so high above it was lost in the darkness, but something was moving up there, something too large to comprehend. And then, at the center of the chamber, they saw it. A mass of flesh, bone, and writhing forms, shifting constantly, pulling new shapes into existence and discarding others. The faces of the missing colonists emerged, stretched, and melted back into the entity, their eyes still filled with recognition, still aware of their fate. Some of the faces tried to scream, but their mouths stretched too far, unhinging into gaping, tooth-lined voids before they were reabsorbed into the ever-changing form. It was never a planet. Fisk whispered. Her breath came in gasps.
It was never just a planet.
The realization ripped through her mind, shattering any illusions of survival. This thing, this entity buried beneath the surface for untold eons, had never been dormant. It had been waiting, and they had been feeding it. Vance took a step back. Fisk, tell me you have a plan. She looked at him, and for the first time she had no words. Vance opened fire. The bullets disappeared into the mass, swallowed whole without impact. Nothing they did mattered anymore. The walls began closing, the tunnels sealing themselves, forcing them toward the pulsing center. The mass was not just alive. It was thinking, shifting in response to their presence, anticipating their movements before they made them. One by one, the survivors screamed as they were taken. Some pulled into the walls, others dragged down into the living floor, their faces joining the writhing mass, eyes still moving, still aware. Fisk turned, her vision blurring, her thoughts fracturing. Her limbs felt wrong, as though her body was being redesigned from the inside out. Vance's grip tightened, but his fingers had split apart, extending like tendrils, merging with her own skin. She could feel something crawling beneath his flesh, trying to reach into hers. I see it now, he whispered. We were always meant to return. And then there was only the hum, the rhythmic, ceaseless vibration of the entity, echoing in their minds as they became part of it. The colony was gone. The structures remained, but they were empty, silent. The lights still flickered in the towers, but no one was inside. A new signal echoed from Vesta 7's abandoned relay. It pulsed out into the void, reaching for something else. It was not a distress signal. It was an invitation. A ship, responding to the message, altered its course, unaware of what awaited them. And beneath the surface, the planet breathed again.